Assalamu alaikum, I'm Carl Arrindell and you're watching In Focus. Now, I'm delighted to be joined today by Penny Green, Professor of Law and Globalisation at Queen Mary University in London. I'm sitting in the office of the International State Crime Initiative at Queen Mary University. Professor Green graduated from the Australian National University in 1979 and then completed her Masters and a PhD in Criminology at the University of Cambridge. Director of the International State Crime Initiative, described as a multidisciplinary, cross-institutional and international initiative to collate, analyse and disseminate research-based knowledge about criminal state practices and resistance to them. She is a trustee of the Howard League for Penal Reform, a member of the ESRC Peer Review College, co-editor-in-chief of the international journal State Crime and editor of the Howard Journal. Professor Green, welcome to Islam Channel.
Thank you very much, Carl.
In your role as chair of the International State Crime Initiative, you've acknowledged that there is difficulty in defining state crime. And I think, to use your words, you say it's always likely to be a controversial issue. You suggested that there is possibly a problem in getting that definition, or in terms of the international statutes and so on. Isn't it fair to say that the international human rights conventions exist, that the UN, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, is it more about the mechanisms and possibly the effectiveness of the policing of such crimes that there is a problem with? Are these institutions fit for purpose?
Well, I would say no, emphatically that they are not fit for purpose. And I think that certainly we have conventions and treaties in relation to human rights, we have international courts, but if you look at their impact on repression in the world in which we live, we see that they have almost no impact at all. I mean, very little impact. I think really the solution to these problems is not a legal one. It's a solution that requires political initiatives, and initiatives that derive from below, from organised civil society, from people who themselves are victims of repression around the world. And their organised strength is really the only way that we can overturn repression. And I think, you know, there were elements in the Arab Spring which gave us great courage and great hope for the future, because it was ordinary people organised in their workplaces and in their communities who rose up against dictators. And really, this is the best way to tackle state criminality. And our definition of state crime is not a legal one, because states make laws and are hardly likely to criminalise their own activities. So we rely on a definition which involves human rights violations perpetrated by state agents, state officials, in the pursuit of organisational, not individual goals. And so in order for us to recognise whether or not a human rights violation has taken place, or whether state actors are behaving in a deviant manner, we rely on organised civil society to say, actually, this is happening to us, we're documenting these abuses, we're labelling them criminal, we're defining them as such, and in that way we have a much better framework for understanding the criminality of states.
But then you've also argued that many of the so-called civil societies in Burma do not themselves recognise what's going on against the Rohingyas as breaches. In fact, it's often the agencies from outside, like Human Rights Watch and others, who are making the loudest noise on that, isn't it?
Yes, and I mean, it's one of the dismaying factors of researching civil society inside Burma, that in fact many of the very courageous and brave human rights activists who fought against successive dictatorships in Burma during the years of Slork and so on, that many of those very people who sometimes have served 15, 20 years inside the dictatorship's prisons are not prepared to recognise the violations taking place against the Rohingya as human rights violations. Unfortunately, there is a sense in which there is a fairly uniform acceptance within Burma that the Rohingya are somehow illegal Bengali immigrants. And this falsehood, unfortunately, permeates from top to bottom in Burmese society. It's not to say that there aren't some individuals who do stand up against that, and there are. But in terms of the dominant view, unfortunately that is the case.
Now, you've spoken about the difficulties in classification often arising from the fact, and I think I'm quoting you, and you state that state claims as legal is often a reality crime on a grand scale. I think these are the terms you used, and therefore that resistance to those crimes often ends up being defined as a crime in itself. I cannot help thinking of the famous quote by Thomas Jefferson: if law is unjust, then a man is not only right to disobey it, he is obligated to do so. You have suggested that civil society should play an important role in bringing about a more definitive classification of state crime. What, in your understanding, constitutes civil society, especially in the context of Burma, which I know you've also admitted often have failed to acknowledge that there are breaches in human rights against the Rohingya. And can such classifications carry any weight legally, either domestically or internationally?
Well, I suppose it'd be helpful to start with the definition that we've adopted of state crime, and that's effectively human rights violations which have been perpetrated by state agents in pursuit of organisational goals. So it's not about individuals committing crimes for personal benefit, but it's about the state and its agents committing violations that are assisting the state pursue particular political and economic goals. So that's our definition. Now, we can't rely on law to define state crime, not least because states themselves are the legislatures. That they create the laws, they're less than likely to criminalise their own activities. And so we rely very heavily within our definitional framework on organised civil society in those countries which are affected by state crime, and that's basically every state in the world. And it's the organised workings of communities who are themselves victims of state criminality, state violence, state corruption, who are best placed to define, to label, to expose state criminality. And so for us, civil society is tremendously important.
Now, I gather that you, for a short while, and also members of your team, experts, spent 4 months within Burma gathering evidence, I think in the Rakhine district inhabited by the Rohingya, and you witnessed firsthand some of the atrocities, the persecutions. Firstly, I have to say that given the known restrictions, it surprised me a bit to hear that you'd been able to stay there for such a long time. And what basis were you allowed to stay there, and how significant was the evidence that you uncovered? Is your report a game changer?
We do think, in fact, the report will be a game changer. We have set out to... The question that we were pursuing was whether or not the persecution against the Rohingya could be defined and described accurately as a genocide. And our evidence, the findings that we have gathered, suggests very, very strongly that what we are witnessing inside Rakhine State, inside Burma, is in fact a genocide.
What is the significance of you getting that classification of genocide?
Well, because up until this point, very few organisations, very few people have been prepared to acknowledge or describe what is happening inside Burma as a genocide. They have stopped at the point of crimes against humanity. And I think, you know, of course, you make the label genocide, you define a persecution as genocide. There are implications then for those who make that definition, particularly if you're talking about international states. There's an obligation to do something about it if in fact you subscribe to the view that it's a genocide. The onus on states when there's a crime, when there are crimes against humanity is less. But I think that our evidence that we gathered, and actually we had relatively we were able to conduct a lot of research inside Rakhine State. We were, however, prevented very explicitly from going to northern Rakhine State, where the majority of the Rohingya live, and where, in fact, we understand conditions to be even more destitute and appalling than those we witnessed in the camps in and around Sitwe. So we were able to conduct the research. We were able to talk to both communities, Rohingya and Rakhine, and some state officials. We were able to do very systematic, thorough research over a long period of time with 3 researchers. So in fact, the evidence that we have gathered and the analysis that we are now conducting is very much based on extremely hard evidence.
Now, in a broadcast last week on the BBC flagship current affairs programme Today, you said that your research clearly indicated that genocide had taken place within the Rakhine State region of Burma, where the Rohingyas make up 45% of the population in those regions. When you were asked about the motive for the persecution, you said that Islamophobia underpins what is going on, and not just in respect to the Rohingyas in the Rakhine State, but Muslims throughout Myanmar. Some have said that the government has been behind stirring up hatred against the Muslim minorities to draw attention away from the economic failures across the country. Over the last few years, there have been multiple reports of attacks against, on the ground, mosques being burnt to the ground, houses, Muslim businesses being burnt to the ground, and particularly the riots in 2012, which claimed the lives of more than 200 Rohingyas in what was described as a massacre. And it took place while troops stood by and watched. You say that Muslims are being forced to live in refugee camps which more resemble prisons, and that a few mosques that are still standing are totally deserted. Why have there been
the police and the military
who have
occupied them?
Now, why have there been so few, if any, prosecutions against those people who perpetrated those acts, and how does the government justify it? What do you think is the fuel behind it? Is it ideological or political?
I think, starting with that question first, is it ideological or political? I think it's both. I think that the Rohingya represent a very valuable scapegoat for the new regime in its new phase, if you like. Since 2010-11, we've seen an opening up of Burma, Myanmar, and it's interesting to note that it's in this period that the worst phase of the genocidal policy has begun to take place. I think that's a really critical point. I think that there is a very strong, a very powerful current of Islamophobia operating inside Burma, Myanmar. It is cultivated and fostered by the Union State at national level, who have very successfully been able to manipulate the local Rakhine population, Buddhist monks and so on, who have been, if you like, sort of beacons of hate speech and so on, racism throughout the country. So I think it's a combination of political and ideological. I think it's quite a complex background, but nonetheless that's taking place. But I think we have to understand genocide as a process, and what we have witnessed over a period of decades is in fact the stigmatization of the Rohingya, initially described as somehow illegal Bengali immigrants, the use of the word Kala to denigrate them. That this process of stigmatization is in practice a process of dehumanization.
Let's just get something clear here. The Rohingyas have been in Burma or Myanmar for hundreds of years.
Yes, there's evidence that the Rohingya have had a presence in Burma, Myanmar for hundreds of years. And they were in fact, they did in fact were recognized as citizens of Myanmar until General Ne Win introduced the 1982 citizenship laws, which then removed them from the official list of ethnic minorities inside Burma. There are 135 official ethnic minorities in Burma, but that law excluded them for the first time.
So they become stateless?
So they became stateless. And so, but we start with the stigmatization practice, and that's part of that process. Then we have practices of harassment, both psychological and physical, in which the Rohingya are increasingly marginalized, they suffer sporadic attacks, they are weakened generally. We then have a phase in which they are isolated as a result of that practice of harassment. In 2012, we see a sea change really in the development of the genocide. We had a series of massacres in June and October 2012 in which over 200 Rohingya were murdered by Rakhine mobs, but organised Rakhine mobs. And it's very important to understand that this wasn't communal violence. This was organised violence against the Rohingya. Their houses were burnt down, and they were herded and shepherded very, very explicitly into an isolated area north of Sittwe, into a camp, around Sittwe, sorry, into a camp complex area. So between 120 and 140,000 Rohingya who fled the violence and who were fleeing the burning of their homes were forced into a camp complex area, militarized camp complex area, where they remain today. And so they are completely isolated. They live in the most squalid, desperate conditions, denied adequate food, denied emergency health care. Last year, Médecins Sans Frontières were expelled by the government. They were the only providers of emergency health care to the Rohingya at that time. They are unable to leave that camp area. The one ghetto in Sittwe, the capital Sittwe's centre of town, there are 4,250 Rohingya living inside Ong Mingala, the ghetto. And that ghetto, it should be said, is surrounded by 7 checkpoints, militarised checkpoints, and the people of Ong Mingala are desperately hungry. They have no access to livelihood or employment. And they are very ill, generally speaking, because they indeed, again, have no access to healthcare.
Now, last week our newspaper headlines were full of reports on the tragic circumstances of hundreds of Rohingya Muslims adrift at sea on boats described by the UN as floating coffins. They were fleeing from persecution and were hoping to find sanctuary in neighbouring countries. Now, this incident occurred, I think, at the time when you went public that you were about to publish your report, in which you will declare that the Rohingya are the victims of genocide, as you said. You said they were faced with 2 choices: either stay and face annihilation or flee. I'm aware that a number of human rights groups have described what is taking place as ethnic cleansing, but is annihilation perhaps maybe too strong a word, or are these definitions justified?
I don't think it's too strong a word. I think that what I was describing earlier about the conditions in the camp and the conditions which the Rohingya are currently living under, what we would describe as a bare existence, an absolutely bare existence. It is very difficult for the Rohingya to lead a purposeful life because they are hungry, they are ill, they are depressed. These are very, very grim places. And what we would describe this condition to be is a sort of state of systematic weakening. So I talked about earlier stigmatization, harassment, isolation, and we are now at the phase of systematic weakening. And that is the penultimate stage, before mass annihilation, if we understand genocide as a process. And it is part of the whole social reorganization of Burma, effectively. So I think it is not too strong a word to define what the Rohingya face if something isn't done, if the international community doesn't place increasing pressure on Myanmar to stop the genocide against its people.
Now, Human Rights Watch described the regional countries throughout Asia as part of a policy of denial, or being party to a policy of denial, in which they say with boatloads of desperate people in their waters, they have refused to react. Human Rights Watch went on to suggest that their responses, which it described as based more on hatred than mercy, have been tantamount to a co-conspiracy in the repression of the Rohingya. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I think it is a fair assessment. I think that once media attention started to focus on what was going on, and it was unusually an intense focus on this particular crisis, the governments of Indonesia and Malaysia were forced to at least accept some Rohingya, at least for 12 months. I mean, this is, in itself, is a pathetic response, but nonetheless, you can see what impact pressure can have. Now, I was horrified to see the UN commending the Myanmar government for accepting some of the Rohingya back. I mean, to be commended for accepting back people it has effectively expelled is absurd. So I think that the nations in the region do bear responsibility. But I think, you have to look at countries like Australia, which has taken a particularly appalling stance in relation to the Rohingya. Tony Abbott's position that if we take any of them, it will only encourage more to leave, is actually tantamount to complicity.
But you say that. Can't we say the same of most Western governments who have failed to act meaningfully to provide sanctuary for thousands of refugees fleeing from war-torn Syria, Eritrea, North Africa, and the Middle East?
Yes, I think that Europe's position on asylum seekers falls into precisely the same category. But what we're talking about in Burma is a genocide. And I think that is the particular focus that we need to keep our eyes on. It's not simply, and I don't say simply lightly, it's not simply a humanitarian crisis in the way that many of these governments and the media is representing the boat situation in the Andaman Sea. This is a genocide. The only reason that those people are stuck on these boats in the Andaman Sea is because this is a better option potentially for them than remaining in the squalid, death-inducing conditions in which they currently live.
So what actions should the international community be taking? Economic sanctions, war crimes tribunals in The Hague, military interventions? What are you proposing?
I think that our job as researchers is to understand the situation as it's happening and to describe and analyse what's happening. But certainly there are a range of sanctions that the international community could be placing on Myanmar, not inviting them to ASEAN conferences, not inviting them to the table and accepting their demand not to use the term Rohingya, which is currently being conducted as a summit in Bangkok. That kowtowing to the Burmese government in these circumstances is utterly disgraceful. But in terms of a solution, I think the solution has to come from the Rohingya people and from the Rohingya supporters inside Burma. And at the moment, they are few and far between. And I think, and this is where I think, that Aung San Suu Kyi falls down very gravely, because she had an opportunity. She could have rallied support from human rights activists who could be persuaded to understand the plight of the Rohingya, but she wasn't prepared to stand up and take that stand. And as a result, we have a human rights community inside Burma who are doing great work in relation to land grabs, forced eviction, pollution, military incursions and so on. But they are not prepared at this point to take up the cause of the Rohingya. But these people understand repression. They understand what it's like to have lived under a dictatorship, a series of dictatorships. They understand what it means to have their freedoms denied. It wouldn't take much to convince them to stand side by side the Rohingya.
Now, you spoke about political leaders internationally kowtowing to the discourse of the Burmese government. President Obama visited Burma last November, who's I think the first president in many decades to visit the region. And then you mentioned about Aung San Suu Kyi, who was a Nobel Peace Laureate. She's been, I think you suggested, more than reluctant to say anything. Why are political leadership so reluctant to criticise the Burmese government?
I mean, historically we find that governments generally are reluctant to describe the kind of persecution that we're witnessing in Rakhine State as genocide, because it commits them to a course of action which they're unwilling to commit to. Burma began opening up. It offers all kinds of economic inducements at the moment. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of natural resources inside Burma. International capital is investing heavily, and this is something that international governments are reluctant to jeopardise after the country was closed for so many years. So I think that those factors inhibit governments taking a very strong stand.
So it's suspending international values for international interests?
Yes, international economic and political interests. Yes.
Now, I know you just got back from a major conference in Oslo, in Norway, in which you made a an address on the issue of the persecution of the Rohingya. I read one headline saying that 7 Nobel Peace Laureates who attended the conference, which included Bishop Desmond Tutu, openly proclaimed, put their names to the labelling of what's taking place there as genocide. What do you hope that the conference will have achieved or will be able to achieve?
I very much hope that the conference, which I have to say was a very exciting and encouraging conference. There were a significant number of the Rohingya diaspora and Rohingya from Yangon. And there were human rights activists and organisations and academics all working together. There were the former UN Special Rapporteur on Burma, Myanmar, Thomas Quintana was also there. What we recognised was a significant shift now to accepting that what's happening is a genocide. And I think one of the things that we might want to carry forward from that conference was a statement by George Soros, actually, who said, in 1934, I was a Rohingya. As he was escaping Nazi persecution, and the idea that he is drawing a link, a very clear parallel with what is happening in Rakhine State, with what was happening in 1930s Germany and Hungary and the region. Certainly that is a finding that we have made, that the parallels, particularly when you look at the ghetto in Sittwe and the camp complex, the parallels with the treatment of the Jews are incredibly powerful. And we have an opportunity. We recognise this. We're saying that we are at a stage prior to mass extermination. We can do something about it. If we act together, we can prevent the mass annihilation of the Rohingya people. But we have to recognise that it is a genocide in process, and that if we don't act now, there will be no Rohingya.
With those profound words, Professor Penny Green, Chair of the International State Crime Initiative, thank you very much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to speak with me. Thank you for joining me on Islam Channel.
My pleasure. Thank you, Carl.